Let us wait so that the others can join the meeting, and after this we will start the class. I hope I am audible to you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's wait so that the others can join, and when the participant will be more than 10, then I will start.
सर ये जो हमारी क्लास है ये एक डे पे शिफ्ट नहीं हो सकती कि ऐसे बाय पार्ट्स ना हो, वन डे पे चली जाए?
ये आप ही के कुछ भाई थे जिन्होंने जो है आगे जाके रिक्वेस्ट की है कि 3 घंटे हम बर्दाश्त नहीं कर सकते, तो लिहाजा इनको पार्ट्स में किया जाए। उनके कहने पे ये चेंज हुआ है।
सर इस तरह बड़ा इशू हो रहा है, अगर हमने कोई और इलेक्टिव सब्जेक्ट लेना है तो हाफ इधर से है, बाकी क्योंकि उधर तो फुल क्लासेस हैं तो हाफ इधर आके लेना पड़ता है, वो छोड़ना पड़ता है इस तरह।
हाँ, ये चीज़ हमारी भी समझ से बाहर है। अब हो सकता है एचओडी से रिक्वेस्ट कर लें, अगर आपको कोई वो है क्लास को,
ठीक
एचओडी
है
को
सर।
एचओडी को या डीन को कन्वे कर दें। कुछ स्टूडेंट्स को इशू है, तो उससे हो सकता है कि तब्दील भी हो जाए। फ़िलहाल तक तो यही है कि कुछ स्टूडेंट्स ने शायद कहा है कि हम ज़्यादा पढ़ना चाहते हैं और 3 घंटे जो है वो एक साथ हम नहीं कर सकते, तो उस वजह से ये चेंज हुआ है।
ठीक है सर, थैंक यू।
I have shared the slides, so the slides are visible to you. Please confirm.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Okay,
sir.
so let's start with the first lecture of watershed management. It is regarding, it's an introductory lecture and it's an overall view of watershed management. In this lecture, we will discuss few concepts related to watershed management, and we will see why watershed management is necessary and what are the main components of watershed management and what we will discuss in our upcoming lectures. So the first thing which we will discuss, it's sustaining healthy freshwater ecosystem. The basic goal is to provide fresh water and sustain healthy environment in our ecosystem. Whoever comes under the ecosystem should get fresh water and healthy things for their life, for their living. Coming on the ecosystems, what is ecosystem? It's basically a natural functioning unit which interact with biotic and abiotic components in a system whose boundaries are determined by the cycle and flux of energy, material and organisms. So it basically describe the life, the living animals, humans, and then in another way it also discuss the energy which can come in the form of sunlight, solar energy, and there are different types of ecosystem, and every ecosystem has its own specific boundary, and within a geographic area there could be diverse ecosystem. For example, if we talk about this capital and some of far furlong areas from this capital, there are forests. Some areas of the KPK are Murray, which are densely or highly forest based. So we can call them forest ecosystem. And another could be watershed based ecosystem. In a watershed, most of the parts may contain diverse land use. However, it it should contain some of the nalas or lakes or water bodies. Another could be the wetland ecosystems. So there could be watersheds which has all of these properties. A single watershed may contain diverse ecosystem. So as a watershed manager, we should know regarding the watershed ecology, which basically tells us what are the functional characteristics that can influence the structure of our watershed and how human and other animals and other natural communities can coexist within this environment. How we can make it sustainable, healthy for all these livings. So fresh water, coming to the point, fresh water is necessary for almost all the living beings on the earth. Either it's human or it's animal or it's bird, anything which breathe, even crops, plants, so everything require water. So they are there could be dependency on rivers, lakes, wetland, and underground aquifer, and the water demand could vary. It could be for drinking purposes, it could be for irrigating crops, and if we talk about the modern humans need, then it could be related to the industrial processes. To run our industry, to run our irrigation system, to irrigate our crops, we may need water. So when we talk about the ecosystem, as I mentioned yesterday, that in past we were not aware and we were not able to recognize the functionality of biologically complex ecosystem, which basically provides us many valuable commodities and serve our society. We are getting different services. However, some of us don't acknowledge them or maybe don't even know about them. So when we talk about these services, there are certain things which I will mention here. For example, a sustainable ecosystem can help us to mitigate flood. It can help us to control the flood disasters. How it can help us to control the floods? If we would have a balanced ecosystem which could contain forest, vegetation, grass, and greenery. So when it comes towards the flood, maybe we can face less erosion due to forest. They can stop or they can delay extreme floods. So they have a definite role. If I have to talk about their role, then maybe one lecture could be less to talk about their role. So in generally, we know that floods, the forest can can be helpful during the flooding season. They can delay flood and they can retain precipitation. Similarly, transportation, we we are using the water and we transfer goods from one place to another place by using boats. The next thing is recreational activities. The lakes, Rawal Lake in Islamabad, Khanpur Lake, and another famous lake around the world are best source for recreation. Similarly, these can be helpful for purification of human and industrial wastes. Most of the wastes within Pakistan, if I talk about Pakistan, you guys belong from different parts of Pakistan. So you have noticed the waste of your city, either it's domestic or it's industrial waste. Finally, we are throwing it in Indus River, or it's either its main river or its tributary. Without any treatment, we are just transferring it towards the river, and finally it's going towards the Arabian Sea. Another thing another service which we get is plants and animals, the the living things. They are receiving their food, and then as a human we can utilize them. For example, I will talk about fisheries. So we are eating fish and other foods, seafoods, or some other things which basically comes from lakes. So these are just limited services which I have discussed. There are so many things and it can be expanded. So these benefits which we have discussed, it can be known as ecological services. The ecologist calls them ecological services which are less acknowledged. And as an engineer, we don't have awareness about them. In developing countries, until now, we don't have, even you guys have read different engineering programs. So there was, I guess there may be no course which was related to ecology and which have acknowledged these services, or you got any awareness in this regard. The same is the case with the developed countries. So the content which I am presenting, it's basically from a famous professor. So the case is same with Canada and US. These lectures and these overviews are basically taken from their lectures. So when we talk about the ecological services, these can be defined as the condition and processes through which natural ecosystem and species that make them up, sustain and fulfill the human life, human needs. So these are costly, and sometimes it's impossible for us to replace them. For example, I will mention here about the Raval Dam. Every year we see that the aquatic life, the fisheries within the Raval Dam, they, they face a disease. Either it's natural or it's due to humans. I have heard that they mix some chemical within the lake so that the fisheries could die. But however, it is a problem. After every 5 or 10 years, we see such issues within the lake, and at that time, it's impossible to buy a cheap fish. To ship fish within this territory, within the capital, becomes too much expensive, and we have to pay a lot to buy the fish. So nowadays the aquatics ecosystems are being severely altered or destroyed at a greater rate than any other time in the human history, and it's going faster, and no efforts are being made to restore this. There are different types of fisheries. If you see some documentaries on the Indus Basin, even in local news a few days ago, I was just watching that they have found a famous species. It was a type of fish, and it just appeared for a long time, maybe 20 or 50, 20 or 30 years later, they have noticed that types of that type of fish. So we are not doing any kind of effort. I will also mention some migratory birds. If anyone here is from the Sindh province, he can share more details about that. In Sindh province, there is a lake. I forgot its name. So that lake, normally they in the time of uh, summer or winter, there is a specific season within the year that the migratory birds comes around that lake and they stay there. I was reading an article, so it was about the restoration of that lake. So within the time, the number of these birds got reduced, but recently they made some efforts, and I just seen some statistics which showed that during the past 2 or 3 years, the number of the migratory birds are increasing. So it was basically an effort to restore the ecosystem of the lake and maintain it. So such efforts should be made, and we should debate regarding the sustainable allocation of water resources, and we should recognize the ecological services. We should maintain the integrity of our goals, and we should consider the demands of human as well as the other inhabitants living within that ecosystem. As I mentioned, hydrologist, engineer, and water manager, these are the people who design and manage the nation's water resources system, and they are rarely taught about the ecological consequences. And during the management policies, these engineers and hydrologist and water resource manager, they even don't know how to how to recognize these ecological services. So the same is the case with the ecologist. They are also rarely trained to consider the critical role of water in human society. So for them, the most of the water should be preserved for the ecological services. As in my previous lectures I have mentioned, different countries have different stance regarding their water policy. For example, if I talk about Australia, so they pay more attention toward the ecological needs. In past few years ago, there was water shortage and they started killing the camels. So, and there came a debate that why this is happening. So this was basically the concept, their concept regarding the distribution of water. So they saying ecology is first. First we have to preserve the ecology, and later we have to think about the humans' needs and other things need. So the same is the problem with ecologists and economists, developers, and politicians. They seldom know enough regarding the future implication of a project, and in short term plans they mostly the ecological sides are almost ignored. So there should be a coherent policy, and equitability should be regarding the distribution of water resources so that we could fulfill the needs of society and ecosystem could function. So when we talk about the ecosystem, the integrity of ecosystem, what could be the requirement for freshwater ecosystem integrity? The freshwater requirements and freshwater ecosystem basically differ greatly from one another, and it depends on the on types, location, and climate. However, some features are common and important. For example, for lakes, wetlands, rivers, and their connected groundwaters, they share a common need for water within a certain range of quantity and quality. The structure and functioning of freshwater ecosystem are also tightly linked with the watershed or catchment from where they belong, if the watershed has watershed or catchment has different types of activities, especially if it is human influenced, then the functioning of the ecosystem is hard, it's not easy. And materials generated across the landscape ultimately make their way into river, lakes, and other freshwater ecosystem. As I mentioned that if I talk about the Indus and then Arabian Sea, so how we are polluting it and how our cities are contributing to world the changes regarding the aquatic lives. So whatever we human do, ultimately it will affect the ecosystem and its integrity. So freshwater ecosystem differ greatly from one another. It's and if we talk about the dynamic environmental factors, so few factors have been identified which regulate much of the structure and functioning of any aquatic ecosystem, although their relative importance vary among aquatic ecosystem type. It will be shown in next slide. And then the interaction of these drivers with respect to space and time define the dynamic nature of freshwater ecosystem. So here is the diagram which basically describes the requirements for freshwater ecosystem integrity. When I say what are the requirements for freshwater ecosystem integrity, how we can have a sustainable ecosystem, then this diagram will answer the questions. The first thing is within this diagram, the first thing is flow regime. How the flow is happening around the different part of watershed. And the second is what are the factors which are influencing the water quality. These could be sediment, these could be chemical, and the thermal impact, the lights, different types of lights. I remember one of my lab fellow, he was working on the impact of Zarek Khan. So the next thing is biotic assembling and functional aquatic system. There could be short-term goods and services, and there could also be long-term sustainability and adaptive capacity. So the requirement of freshwater ecosystem integrity, the flow pattern define the rates and pathway by which rainfall and snowmelt enter and circulate within the river channel, lakes, wetlands, and finally it connects the groundwater. And it also determines how long water is stored in these ecosystems. As I mentioned in the diagram, the second thing is sediment and organic matter inputs, and these could be the raw material which create physical habitat structure like refugia, substratus, and spawning grounds, and supply and store nutrients that sustain aquatic plants and animals. So few of the terms are pure ecological. These are related to ecology. We will simplify it and consider it as sediment or organic matter. And third thing is temperature and light characteristics, which regulate the metabolic process and activity levels and productivity of aquatic organisms. Similarly, chemical and nutrient conditions, these regulate pH, plant and animal productivity and water quality. The plant and animal assemblage influences ecosystem process rates and community structures. So the sustainability, how we can ensure the sustainability? We can ensure the sustainability by balancing human use and need of fresh water for ecosystem. There should be a balance. The sustainability can be best ensured by maintaining the naturally variable flows, adequate sediment and organic matter inputs, natural fluctuation in heat and light, clean water, and a naturally diverse plant and animal community. We should not change the things as per our choice. For example, if I mention about a river, so we have almost in all the rivers, we have almost all the river of the world, we have developed dams, barrages to store the water. So it has changed the hydrological cycle and patterns, natural patterns of the flow, which finally have an impact on the ecosystem. If we fail to provide these essential requirement, then the ecosystem will not serve and we will not get those services properly. There will be a stage when a decline will start in these services, and within the time we will lose them. So aquatic ecosystem can be protected or restored by recognizing the following. What are the things? Aquatic ecosystems are not simply isolated bodies or conduit but are tightly connected to terrestrial environment. Aquatic ecosystems are connected to each other and provide essential migration routes for species. If we change the flow flow pattern, then these routes will get disturbed and the species will get influence. The second is dynamic pattern of flow that are maintained within the historical range of variation. And it will promote the integrity and sustainability of freshwater system. So we should not change the pattern of flows and we should restore them. The third is aquatic ecosystem additionally require the sediment load, heat and light conditions, chemical and nutrient inputs, and plants and animals population fluctuate within the natural ranges. So we should not mix chemicals. We should treat them instead of throwing them in water. So the integrity of the ecosystem can be maintained if we follow these steps. So what are the benefit of ecosystem services which are basically provided to the humans? These services maintain the biodiversity and production of ecosystem goods such as seafood, wild game, forage timber, biomass fuel, natural fibers, and many other pharmaceutical and industrial product and their byproduct. The harvest and trade of these goods represent important and familiar parts of the human economy. These have contribution in our economy and they have some role to benefit the economy. And finally, they also support the life. So here is a list of benefits which are supplied to humans by ecosystem. First is purification of air and water. If ecosystem will work properly, we will not have air pollution, we will not have water pollution. It can mitigate droughts and floods if we will have nice ecosystem and it will work properly, then there will be less droughts and floods, and these are also helpful in the soil fertility, detoxification and decomposition of wastes, pollination of crops and natural vegetation, dispersal of seeds, cycling and movement of nutrition. It controls majority of potential agricultural pests. They also maintain the biodiversity, protection of coastal shores from erosion by waves, protection from the sun's harmful ultraviolet rays, partial stabilization of climate, moderation of weather extreme and their impacts, and finally aesthetic beauty and intellectual stimulation that lift the human spirit. So, what are the characteristics of ecosystem services? The first thing is production of ecosystem goods. Humanity obtains from natural ecosystem an array of ecosystem goods. Organisms and their parts and products that grow in wild that are directly used to benefit the human beings. As I already mentioned, fishes, animal products, these are commonly traded in economic markets. And natural ecosystem also provide a vegetation. As a human, we directly use this. We can also use timber for fueling purpose, fiber, pharmaceutical and industrial products. Many fruits, nuts, mushrooms, honey, and other foods, these are extracted from forest species. So ecosystem services are dependent on these species. The second character is generation and maintenance of biodiversity. Biodiversity is generated and maintained in natural ecosystem. If as a human we will influence it, then it will be hard to maintain the biodiversity. And the ability to increase the crop productivity nowadays, it's due to new pest, diseases, and other stress which has happened heavily upon the transfer to our crops of genes from wild crop relatives that confer resistance to these challenges. Due to biodiversity, we have developed different due to different pests. We have developed different seeds and we have improved our agriculture. And the third character of ecosystem service is climate and life. When climatic cooling leads to drops in the sea level, continental shelves are exposed to the winds and rain, which cause greater nutrient runoff to the ocean. And these nutrients can be fertilizer to the growth of phytoplankton and many of others from which we can get calcium carbonate. Besides their impact on atmosphere, ecosystem also exert direct physical influence that help to moderate regional and local weather. For example, transpiration. It releases a release of water from the crops, from the plants. In the morning, it causes thunderstorm. In the afternoon, and it limit both moisture loss from the region and then rise in the surface temperature. It can also be helpful to mitigate the floods and droughts. Plants and plant litter shield the soil from the full destructive forces of raindrop and hold it tightly in some places. When landscapes are redundant. Rain compacts the surface and rapidly turns soil in muddy form. And these mud clogs have cavities which reduce infiltration, and then finally these increase the runoff. On larger scale, extensive deforestation in Himalayan region has been observed as one of the cause of flooding, especially in some parts of Bangladesh and India. It has been acknowledged, and even in Nepal, that due to extensive deforestation, the flooding event has been observed and it has increased. And Africa, they face drought. It is related to extensive deforestation. Studies have been performed and the researchers have concluded that extensive deforestation can be a cause of increased events of droughts and flooding. So, different human activities are threats to ecosystem. And their list of these activities. Few of these activities are emission of the carbon, nitrogen, and other gases of fossil fuel, which is a threat to ecosystem services. And there should be public-private partnership to restore the ecosystem and to acknowledge the aquatic ecosystem services. So this was in previous slides. There was just an overview regarding the course of watershed management, and the main things which we will discuss will be the aquatic services, ecosystem services. So why we need watersheds? Why we should manage our watershed? Managing the watershed makes a good sense of environmental friendly environment, financially and socially better environment. Nowadays, many public and private organizations, they are creating multidisciplinary approaches and they're making different types of partnership to address these issues. And even community by community, watersheds are identified for each community, and then different attempts are being made to restore these watershed in their original condition so that maximum benefit could be obtained. One of the approach which is being practiced, it's watershed approach. So it is a coordinating framework for environmental management which focus public and private sector efforts and address the highest priority problem with hydrologically defined geographic areas. And it take both ground and surface water flows in consideration. So what could be the guiding principles for watershed approach? There are environmental protection agencies in different countries which support watershed approaches, which aim to prevent pollution and sustain environmental improvements. Although watershed approaches may vary in terms of specific objective priorities, timings, and resources, however, there is a guideline which should be followed while adopting any watershed management approach. First thing is partnership. There should be partnership, and we should consider the people which are mostly affected by management decisions. They should be involved in decision making. It will ensure the environmental objectives are well integrated and the stakeholders are included, and it also provide the people who are dependent on these resources, they will be partner, and they will have a sense of responsibility, and they will try to implement the policy. The second thing is it should be geographic focus. Within specific geographic areas, different activities are directed, and those areas should be considered from where the runoff is generated and tributaries are coming, so that the people should have awareness and they would be responsible to make this policy successful. And the management techniques should be based on strong science and data. We should collect data. Scientific tools and technology should be used in decision making. Assessment and characterization of natural resources should be performed. There should be some goal setting, some environmental objectives should be set, and vulnerability of these resources and aquatic system within that community should be identified. Sound management techniques should be based on identification of priority problems. We should identify and prioritize the problems, and then develop specific management options and action plans. And in third stage, we should implement them and evaluate them within the time and see their needs. So when stakeholder will come together, so information will be shared, concerns will be addressed, then we will see a nice approach which will facilitate and benefit everyone. Operating and coordinating on watershed basis makes good sense of environmental, financial, social, and administrative reason. The results should be reviewed, pollution should be controlled, and human activities should be reduced. And environmental indicators should be followed. And different environmental indicators are available. So we should follow any specific guideline regarding the environmental indicator. So there should be coordination among the communities so that there should be no duplication of the efforts, and teamwork should be done. When there will be teamwork, then the policy or the approach will benefit every individual. So there are few guiding principles through which state and tribal watershed approaches are implemented. Based on observation, it has been concluded that these general principles should be followed. What are these principles? We should involve the stakeholder. As I mentioned earlier, that there should be partnership. We should consider the geographic management unit. There should be coordination, and there should be a management schedule. We should follow any schedule so that we should set goals. Next is watershed ecology. Watershed ecology is essential knowledge for watershed managers because it teaches us how to make watershed functional. So the watershed natural process like rainfall, runoff, groundwater recharge, sediment transport, all these things are included within the watershed ecology, and we should understand them. So what could be the watershed functions? It could be transport and storage, cycling and transformation, ecological succession. As a water resource manager, we should focus on water quality issues, and we should also focus on the water quantity issues. The amount of flow which is coming in the river, it should be monitored. How much water is coming and how much water does a river need, and how much water does a river need, like the environmental pros, and we can also call it range of variability approach. It's based on few principles like river ecosystem and native species dependent upon them can best be conserved by protecting as much as possible, because we will not preferably perfectly understand how much alteration are being done in flow regime. And here is the diagram of adaptive management cycle. We should have site conservation plan, experimental design should be performed, and baseline monitoring should be done. Then modeling and strategical implementation should be, and finally we should measure the progress, collect data, and evaluate the response. The next is ecological signature of natural flow regime. The natural flow patterns have been changed within the time. As I mentioned earlier, that there are different types of fish and species, and they require certain depth for their survival. When we have developed the channels, we have developed the dams, barrages, so we have altered the natural system and we have altered the flooding. Okay, let's have a short break. So lastly, human alterations to natural flows. Human activities have altered the natural flows, and as I mentioned, the operation of dams have changed the flooding season, and there are some softwares and methods which are used, and one of the famous is IHA, indicator for hydrologic alteration. It can be used to identify the degree to which humans have changed the flow regime. That was all about today's lecture. If you have any question, you can feel free to ask. Okay, if you don't have any question, then I will download the attendance from the participants list. Downloaded the attendance, and there are almost 19 participants. So there is no question. Mohammed Bakar.
जी सर।
कोई सवाल?
नो सर।
चलें, ठीक हो गया। फिर आज की क्लास यहीं तक। इंशाल्लाह आपसे जो है नेक्स्ट वीक मुलाकात होती है।